All right, and everyone's starting to file in. That's great. Welcome, everyone. We're going to let people spend a little time getting connected, and we'll start the webinar for RIP2 here in a few minutes. So if that's what you're here for, you're in the right place.
I'm showing the attendees have stalled out at 12. Are you seeing that?
Yeah. It could be. Oh, there we go. So they might come. Oh. They're coming again. If you're just joining us, we'll be starting in a couple minutes. We're just letting folks have some time to get connected and work out any technological challenges. So probably get started about three minutes after, something like that. So Linda, I see you had a question about whether yesterday's session has been posted. We haven't gotten around to downloading it and posting it on our on our website yet, but we're planning on doing that after tonight's session. So hopefully tomorrow, if we can swing it, or Monday later. And just a reminder to folks, the session is being recorded, but your faces are not on, not being displayed. So it's just our faces and your names, and we'll get Q&As, and Sandra will talk you through all that. Just so you know, if you see that recording symbol in the top left corner, it's just recording us.
Well, should we get started, Morgan?
Yeah, let's do it.
7:04.
Got a pretty good group of attendees so far, so let's.
Great. Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is the information session for the Residential Infill Project Part 2, and we're calling it Part 2 because we've done a project as a community called Part 1 before. My name is Sandra Wood, and I'm a city planner with the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability with the City of Portland, and I'll be moderating tonight's conversation. There are several other planners with me today. Morgan Tracy is the project manager, and he'll wave at you for a second there. And along with us is Shannon Bune, and they're here to help us answer questions through the Q&A function, which I'll talk about in a minute. As Morgan said, this information session is being recorded. So those who have missed today's opportunity will be able to view it later on our project website. So a couple of things we wanted to cover before we get into the presentation is making sure you're in the right place. This is a zoning code and zoning map amendment project. And so what we're Portland. We suspect that many of you our homeowners, and we'll do we had around 30 attendees, and we were able to answer, I think, everybody's questions, presumably to their side. About an hour and a half for this discussion. What we have planned is for Morgan to give a 30-minute presentation, and he's going to do that in 2 parts. The first part will be about the changes that'll apply to properties that are zoned R10 and R20. The second part of the presentation will be about the changes proposed to all single dwelling zone properties. So it'll be helpful for you to know what your property is zoned. So he's included some slides showing you how to look that up front, so you'll know which zone you're in as he's having the discussion. We encourage you to ask general questions tonight rather than site-specific questions. If you do have a general question, please type it into the Q&A in the bottom of the screen. Your question will be viewable to all attendees, so we wanted to let you know about that. Shannon and Phil will do their best to answer the questions as they come in. If we feel that others could benefit from hearing the answer to your question, we'll just ask it live during the Q&A time. I'll do my best to try to say the person's name of which question we're asking, so that you can make sure that you listen to the answer. And Morgan will be the one answering most of those questions. Site-specific questions can definitely be answered also, but we feel the best way to do that is through the interactive mapping tool called the Map app, or by emailing us or calling us, and Morgan will provide that information in just a minute when he gives his presentation. So thank you again very much for being here. We have about 20 attendees so far, but as it'll probably happen like last night, that other people will attend the meeting as we go along. So I'll pass it on to Morgan. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. So there was a little bit of freezing, at least on my end, so that might have happened with other folks on the other end. So if we miss something critical there, we'll probably cover it again before we launch into the general Q&A. But the main point being is, if you have questions along the way during the presentation, feel free to type those into the Q&A, and we'll have Phil and Shannon responding on the way, and we'll actually take a brief pause somewhere in the middle of the presentation to provide some room for questions there as well. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I get this right. Can folks see that? All right. Before we dive into the second part of the residential infill project, I wanted to rewind a bit and touch on a few of the reasons why we started residential infill project in the first place. So back in 2015, when this started, there was a spike in demolitions fueled by a rise in demand and increased housing costs. As the house prices climbed higher, what previously would have been too costly to demolish and rebuild became more profitable and more practical to do so. Aside from the loss of smaller, less expensive homes being replaced by larger, less compatible homes, these demolitions and replacements were not doing anything to add more housing. This was largely a demand and supply problem. On the demand side, we had a growing population, higher wage jobs in the city, record low interest rates, and demand from younger millennials entering the starter home market. And on the supply side, we had a deficit of new home starts. We have a city with 75% of its land reserved for single houses, accounting for land where housing is allowed, that is. And only about 3,000 vacant tax lots of about 131,000. So the full disclosure, there are other lots that have development potential in terms of being divided, but in terms of lots that were ready to accommodate a new house, 3,000 tax lots that were vacant. When the initial residential infill project staff report was published in 2015, median home prices had increased at that point by 44% to $225,000. Today, the median home price in Portland is about $540,000, which is still a good deal when thinking about the median home price in the state of California is over $800,000. So a little bit of context in where we sit in terms of the West Coast. Seattle is about the same at about $800,000. So the residential infill project set out to create a new zoning paradigm for all those single family lots, so that if and when they develop, the potential to create more smaller sized homes would be allowed. The state legislature passed a couple bills that require cities to allow middle housing, and this was largely patterned on residential infill, but went a couple steps further. And so now we have to circle back and address a few things that got left out the last time around. So for tonight's agenda, I'm going to give a presentation and talk about those state mandates, give an overview about how to use the map app, provide some information about the first set of proposals, which apply specifically to the lower density R10 and R20 zones. We'll take a brief pause, and I'll continue with the remaining proposals, cover the timeline for the project, and then give you information about how to submit testimony for the Planning and Sustainability Commission. So what are the state mandates? In 2019 and 2020, the state passed House Bill 2001 and a set of administrative rules to give guidance to cities on how to implement the bill. This bill, also known as the Middle Housing Bill, requires cities to allow more housing types in single dwelling neighborhoods. This means that wherever a house is currently allowed, a duplex must also be allowed. In addition, in certain areas, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and attached houses must also be allowed. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes. In addition, the Senate passed Senate Bill 458 more recently in May of 2021. This bill requires cities to allow the middle housing types allowed under HB 2001 to be divided through an expedited process so that each unit is on its own lot. This provides an option for home ownership rather than rental units or condominium ownerships. This map shows the areas that are affected, the R10 and R20 zones, which are shown in green on this map, as well as the R2.5, R5, and R7 zones, which are shown as yellow, that are potentially affected by these proposed changes. In total, there's about 150,000 lots. The changes in RIP2, specific to the R10 and R20 zones, were mostly already adopted for the R2.5, R5, and R7 zones with the first part of residential infill. So you may be wondering what zone your property is in, or how the proposals may affect where you live. And the map app is an easy resource to find that out. You can find a link to the RIP2 map app on the project website, or go to portlandmaps.com/residential-infill-2. And I really wish the internet didn't make me have to say URLs like that. But there you go. So at the top right corner, you'll see an icon for the map legend. There we go. In addition to the base zone colors, there are symbols for areas where the Z overlay is proposed, and I'll talk about what that is in a few minutes, where it's proposed to be removed, and where non-maintained streets are located. And that will become more important as we talk about these different housing types in a few minutes. So you can click on this box in the top left corner and type in an address. That will bring you up to a specific site when you hit enter, and it'll bring up more detail in a sidebar window. That sidebar window will show you zoning, whether the Z overlay currently applies to the lot or whether it's being added or removed, followed by more detailed information about the relevant proposals. After reviewing the info, you can click on Testify to be taken to a form to submit testimony to the Planning and Sustainability Commission. There are 10 key proposals. The first 6 on the left-hand side carry forward the changes from RIP1 to the R10 and R20 zones, and I'll talk about those in more detail in a few minutes. The final 4 are new proposals that will apply to all the single dwelling zones, including the R10 and R20 zones. So R2.5, R5, R7, R10, and R20. So the first proposal applies only to R10 and R20 lots that are 10,000 square feet and smaller. Most lots in these zones are larger than that, but there are occasionally these smaller lots where incompatible building scale could be an issue. So on lots that are 10,000 square feet and smaller, a new floor area ratio or FAR limit will be applied. Currently, building size is limited only by building coverage and height limits in these areas. This FAR controls the amount of bulk in addition to those other development regulations. So on a site with just a single house, that FAR would be 0.4. And how that's applied is, for example, if you had a 10,000 square foot lot, you would take the lot size, multiply by 0.4, that would give you 4,000 square feet of allowable floor area. The rules exclude basement area, whether it's finished or unfinished, and provide an allowance to add 250 square feet in each 5-year period to accommodate smaller remodels and expansions on existing homes that may be over the maximum FAR. There are also bonuses available for providing affordable units, or if you're adding units to a site with an existing house, such as adding an accessory dwelling unit, you can get an additional floor area for doing that. While this particular proposal was not a requirement of House Bill 2001, a similar approach was applied to the other residential zones in RIP1. Proposal number 2 allows for more duplexes. And a duplex is 2 dwelling units that are located in a single building. So the picture on the right part of your screen shows a conceptual version of a duplex, but they could be arranged in a number of different configurations. One unit on top of the other, side by side, like that picture shows, front to back, and so forth. Duplexes, per House Bill 2001, duplexes will be required to be allowed wherever a house is allowed. So if you can build a house on a particular lot, regardless of its location in the city, a duplex would also be allowed on that lot. Proposal number 3 addresses the House Bill 2001 requirement that cities allow triplexes and fourplexes in most areas, with some exceptions. So unlike the duplex, which is required to be allowed on every lot where a house is allowed, triplexes and fourplexes are limited to particular areas. So these types of developments are 3 units in a single building would be a triplex, 4 units in a single building would be a fourplex. And they're allowed on lots that meet minimum lot size requirements. So in the R10 zone, that's 6,000 square feet. In the R20 zone, that's 12,000 square feet. They would have to be located outside of the Z overlay, and they would have to have frontage on a maintained street. These are already allowed in R2.5, R5, and R7 zones, subject to similar limitations, and they're required by House Bill 2001. Proposal number 4. As an alternative to triplexes, proposal number 4 allows 3 units on a lot through added accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. ADUs are also known as in-law flats, granny flats, secondary units, carriage houses. It's where the Fawns lived in happy days. So this proposal would allow a house to have not just 1 ADU, but 2. Only 1 ADU would be allowed to be in the same building as the house. So the notion here is that if you're building an ADU, the maximum number of units you would have in a single building would be 2. So a house with an internal ADU and a detached ADU, or 2 detached ADUs, or a separate building that contains 2 ADUs in the same building. Also, duplexes would now be permitted to have a detached ADU. This proposal is not a requirement of House Bill 2001, but increases options for retaining existing homes and already applies in the other single dwelling zones, as well as multi-dwelling and commercial mixed-use zones. At the City Council hearings during the final stages of Residential Infill Part 1, a change was passed by City Council that allows for up to 6 units on a lot when at least half of the units are income restricted to households earning up to 60% of the median family income, which is roughly about $1,200 a month for a 2-bedroom unit with utilities included. Again, this proposal is not a requirement in House Bill 2001, but already applies in the other single dwelling zones and is limited to the same sorts of requirements. Minimum lot area requirements outside of the Z overlay, has to be on a street that's maintained. This proposal applies to sites where 3 or more units are proposed. So sites with a triplex, a fourplex, a house with 2 ADUs, a duplex with an ADU, those deeply affordable units. There are no ADA requirements that apply to these smaller housing types. So there's nothing that requires homes be accessible. However, our population is living longer, so our average population age is getting older. Access to homes for folks with mobility impairments is already fairly limited. Most homes have at least one step to enter the house. So this proposal will require that one of the units on these sites with 3 or more would have a no-step entry, wider doors for mobility devices, with a bathroom and living area on the main floor to make the unit visitable and more readily modifiable for a resident's specific needs. This also is not a requirement of House Bill 2001, but is already required for sites proposing 3 or more units in the higher density residential zones. All right, so I'm going to take a break there and see if we have some questions rolling in.
Yeah, we did have some questions rolling in. Thanks, Morgan. We did have some questions. There are 5 questions, I believe, and they've all been answered because they were pretty easily answered, and people can take a look at those right now. But why don't we just pause for a couple of minutes, because I think you shared quite a bit with those 6 proposals, and see if others have some questions that they'd like to ask. Again, you want to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions, and we can answer them before we move on to the second part of the presentation.
Did anybody ask who the Fonz was?
No one asked who the Fonz was, but I really, really liked your mention of the Fonz. So we have a couple questions. The one that's coming in is, that means that a duplex can theoretically use all of the lot?
Oh, that's a really good point. So one of the things that I didn't spend any time covering in here is there are a number of existing development standards that apply to houses and would apply similarly to duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. And one of those really important regulations is building coverage. So building coverage dictates how much of the lot can be covered by structures. And that has not changed with this project and didn't change with the Residential Infill Part 1. And an interesting interplay between the building coverage limitation and floor area limits is that it tends to promote 2-story construction versus spreading the building out over the lot on 1 story. So if you want to build more efficiently, you're going to build 2-story structures, which reduces your building coverage and provides more open area on the lot. We also addressed in RIP Part 1 some issues about how the building height was measured. So we're not proposing any changes regarding how that is done, but that was an issue that we tackled with RIP 1. So this is really, there's a lot of changes that were incorporated with RIP 1 to address a lot of the compatibility concerns with new development, FAR being one of them, but changes to the building height and some other modifications to help improve building compatibility were already adopted with RIP 1.
Good, thanks. So in other words, lot line to lot line development would not be allowed. The side yard setbacks, the front and rear yard setbacks, building coverage and height still apply, in addition to the FAR maximums.
Yep, that's right.
So can you talk a little bit more about the definition of maintained streets?
Yeah, so we'll talk about, I guess we don't talk about that.
That's what I was thinking. It's not in the Z overlay. It's this is the time.
So yeah, good. I'm glad you're asking. So the status of whether a street has been accepted for maintenance or not is a determination that PBOT makes based on the pavement width and the depth of cross section, the construction that the street was built to. So how much base layer was put in, how much asphalt was put in, with the objective of that street being able to support the weight of a fire truck, 75,000 pound point loads on a certain width street to get adequate fire access, get a fire truck down the street. So PBOT has a map layer that they maintain. It's available also on Portland Maps, and the information is also in our map app of the streets that have been certified as meeting that standard, and that the city is taking over the ongoing maintenance for it, which means that as the street requires maintenance, the city is on the hook for it. There are other streets that you may be familiar with that have, gravel surface or look a little bit iffy in terms of their pavement condition, but that haven't been accepted for maintenance by the city, which means the ongoing maintenance responsibility is put on the adjacent property owners until the street has been brought up to a standard that the city will accept it.
And PBOT means?
Thank you. Portland Bureau of Transportation.
Yeah, so they're our transportation department, and they're the ones who maintain the layer. Many people probably don't know that parts of the city weren't part of the city forever, right? That we have annexed different parts of the city, that what we know now as Portland. Over time, there was a lot of annexation that occurred in the 80s and early 90s of East Portland. And as part of each of those annexation agreements, it was taking a look at the streets to see how they were built. And the county, both counties, all three counties actually had different standards in the city themselves. So sometimes we annexed areas and said, but we don't want to maintain these streets because they're not paved to our standards. Right. So the map app, when that Morgan shared, has, when you type in an address, it has the unmaintained streets shown on the map app. So those aren't the ones that are maintained, those little red dot lines all over that.
Yeah, so look for this symbol. As you zoom in, you'll see little dashed lines where the streets are not accepted for maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the other thing we learned last night was there are approximately 60 miles of unpaved streets in the city.
Yeah, it's a lot. Parking, let's talk about parking for a second. What are the parking requirements for, let's start with what's a parking requirement for a house and an ADU, and then all of these other middle housing types.
Yeah, so the minimum parking requirement for residential uses in the residential zone is 0. There is no minimum parking requirement. Whether it's a house, duplex, triplex, or fourplex.
And a related question, does the land division for middle housing change off-street parking requirements?
Does the land division for middle housing change? No.
I think if you divide the property and you have, several separate lots, this parking requirement still is 0.
Right.
Right.
Yep. In a middle housing land division, you could have a situation where you are providing parking. So parking is it's not prohibited. So you can still propose parking and provide parking. And in those cases, there may be need for access easements, or there might be a shared parking tract, an area for shared parking.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a question from Anonymous. I'm not sure I understand the question, but if they meet the width and depth requirements, then duplexes can still be built. So we don't have width or depth requirements for the duplex itself. I don't know if this is still, this question is related to whether a duplex can cover the whole lot. It may be the same person. I'm not sure if Anonymous is the same person.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic parameters are, if someone had a piece of property, the first check is to determine whether that property was legally created. So is it just some random plot of land that somebody wrote a deed for and didn't record, and it showed up as a tax account and someone is trying to build on it? So the first check is that lot legal? Then the second test is, does it meet certain dimensional standards? So in some cases, if it wasn't a legally platted lot, wasn't part of a subdivision originally, then there are some requirements that apply in terms of how much area it is and how much width the lot itself is. Once you get past the status of whether the lot is eligible for a primary structure, then whether you're proposing a house, a duplex, a triplex, if you qualify for that, is all subject to the development standards, the setbacks, the height limits, the building coverage, floor area requirements, and other what we call base zone design standards, things that relate to how the house is oriented to the street.
So going back to the maintained streets, does whether the street has sidewalks have an impact on whether it's maintained or unmaintained?
No, and there are a number of streets that are accepted for maintenance that have basically centerline paving and not curbs and no sidewalks. So it can range from a completely improved sidewalks and street trees, curbs, gutters, pavement, parking, bike lanes. That's sort of the gold standard, all the way down to just a 12-foot wide, I believe. Some minimum width of pavement built to that depth of construction, but no other improvements other than the pavement itself.
Okay. I see we have two people with their hands raised, which we didn't have last night. Let me continue on with the Q&A questions really quick. Back to parking. A question from William. I've experienced many streets where I have to weave around parked cars and stop to allow an oncoming car to pass. A fire engine truck would have difficulty driving on the street. Are such restrictions a concern?
Yeah, so that's generally it's a question for our Bureau of Transportation, who manages the rights of way, and they are looking at how the streets are utilized and whether parking on both sides continues to be allowed or whether the street needs to be restricted to one way. So those are decisions made by PBOT, depending on the intended use and expected amount of traffic through that area.
Since we have a couple hands raised also, we weren't we weren't planning on using the hands raised function, but a couple of people have raised their hands. So I'm going to go ahead and have a couple of people talk. Let's start with Jennifer. I'm going to unmute you.
So I should just say, I think if you're going to show your camera, your face will show up on the video.
That's true. Okay.
Don't be afraid. I just wanted to let you know.
Are you there, Jennifer?
I am here. Can you?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I have some questions. We live further out from the city and we have narrow streets, probably 12 feet, like you said. And there isn't bike lanes, there isn't proximity to bike lanes, there isn't bus service, there isn't a close by grocery store. And I don't know, like, if the sewer system, like how well built it is, and the electricity goes out a lot in the winter. Like for an area that, are we going to be using the same code for kind of more of the, the inward city where you have a lot of access, you can walk to a grocery store or there is a bike lane, that type of building for that type of area? Are we going to be putting the same code for a further out area where it's just kind of a lot of those amenities aren't available or close by?
Gotcha. Yeah. Good question. And it's a little bit of the reason why I'm assuming you're probably in an R10 or R20 zone area. It's a bit of the reason why those zones were not included with RIP1. Was not intended to be mean to those zones or exclude them, but yeah, it followed this general premise that that middle housing, these sort of more accessible, attainable homes would be better situated in areas with what we call a higher housing opportunity score. So they have more access to the things you're talking about, the shops and amenities and,
Transit, more walkable.
Right.
Mhm.
But be that as may, the state bill, the House Bill 2001, sort of countervailed that and said that we want to make sure that the opportunities for housing are provided more throughout cities. And it's not just Portland. That House Bill 2001 applies to cities across Oregon that are over 25,000 people in population, and all the cities in Metro, regardless of their size. So yeah, areas that we were not planning on including initially are now being included because of the changes in that bill. And I think when you see our mapping for the Z overlay map, you'll see some of your conclusions coming out of that Z map for different reasons, frankly, not the amenity basis, but more the natural resource and natural land hazard concerns that we have in those areas.
And so what Morgan will be sharing in the next few proposals, but if the property is proposed to have a Z overlay, then it's just a duplex would be allowed on the property. And if your street is an unmaintained street, which sounds like it probably is, then the higher forms of middle housing wouldn't be allowed. I hope that answers your question, Jennifer.
Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
It does and it doesn't, because I think that there are elements of middle housing that could apply well out here, and then there's other elements that it would be challenging. So is it going to be the same in both places, or is it going to be modified? Like, we don't have the same kind of resources for this, but we could maybe do a duplex, or more ADUs. But, because I understand that populations are changing, and density is part of that. So is there going to be a difference for like the R10, R20s kind of further out places? Or is there a proposed Z overlay that is going to be spread out to the R20 places where there is reduced infrastructure support?
Yeah, so the state bill doesn't allow us to remove areas solely based on infrastructure without the expectation that we're going to come out there and build it in the near term, which the city can't afford to do. But what the bill does allow us to exclude are areas that have natural, like I said, natural hazards or natural resource areas. And I think it might help to see that map that might paint a better picture of how this will play out. But to answer your basic question, is it going to be different for the R10 and R20 zones versus the higher density single dwelling zones in terms of the housing types themselves? That is a duplex, a triplex, fourplex, the multiple ADUs. The same sort of approach will be used in all of those zones. Whether or not you're able to build those higher forms of middle housing is largely dependent on the status of the street and the presence of that Z overlay.
And the development standards are different in those zones than so all the zones have different floor to area ratios. Some of the zones have different setbacks. Building coverage is based on the lot size. So in the R10 and R20 zone, obviously the lots are bigger, so the structures could potentially be larger too, but many of them have the environmental overlay zones on them too. So I think if you have specific questions about your property, Jennifer, I'd recommend that you email us so we can take a look at it and give you a call back. So thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm going to unmute John now. John?
Yeah. Hi, Morgan.
Hey, John.
How you doing tonight? Going to throw you the statutes now talk directly about private streets, and I heard your definition of a maintained street. What about the private streets that are being adequately maintained by their condominium or homeowner associations? How are you guys treating those?
Excellent question. I don't know if that was a plant because I forgot to mention it, but excellent question, John. In the zoning code, how that will work for lots that are fronting on a private street is if the private street connects to a street that's been accepted for maintenance by the city, then that private street, lots on that private street would be eligible. So one thing we did not want to get into was making determinations about the status or the quality of that private street. So that's going to be largely a call by the HOA, I would imagine, or the
Yes.
shared owners of that private street. So there are some other considerations that may complicate proposals on private streets based on the shared nature of the ownership, but whether or not they're eligible depends on what that street is connected to, not that street itself.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Do I have to lower my hand or do you cancel it?
I just did it. I just did it for you.
Thank you. And now I'm hooked up on chat. So,
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, question.
Yeah, in the Q&A. Yep, we're
Yep.
using the Q&A. Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.
Why don't we go ahead? We're caught up on the questions because we have one more question there, but I think we're answering it in the chat. So why don't we go ahead and start on the next set of proposals, which are new to us,
Yeah.
right? Because we did not do these with RIP1.
Yeah, so these proposals 7 through 10 are new sorts of things. The Z overlay map proposal is more of a modification of what we've already done, and I'll spend a little time talking through that. But these are new housing types that the state has required that we accommodate, and so just a few minutes to discuss and explain what those are. So proposal number 7 allows for higher density attached houses in sort of the same sort of certain areas. So maintained streets outside of the Z have to meet the parent parcel before the land division has to meet certain minimum lot size requirements. And these are units that are attached to each other along a shared property line. So if you're looking at that illustration, the blue rectangles sort of represent an imaginary plane where the property line would go through that building. It's already an allowed housing type. So in these zones, you can do attached houses. You can have normal size lots subject to normal type of density with attached houses, and that's already allowed. So what's different here, first change is that we're increasing the number of units that are allowed to be in a row to kind of match what's allowed for a fourplex. So 2 to 4 units would be allowed in R20 through R5 zones, 2 to 8 units allowed in the highest density single dwelling zone, R2.5. The difference really is the higher density. And so what the House bill is really trying to achieve is some sort of parity between allowing for 4 units in a fourplex on a lot versus allowing 4 attached houses on the similar sized lot. Easier said than done. We had to do some mental gymnastics to work out how to change the land division code to accomplish that. But essentially we've got a provision that allows roughly between 2 to 4 times the amount of density for these attached houses versus a regular standalone duplex, triplex, or fourplex. Yeah, and I think the other important aspect here is this would allow for a standard regular land division to create fee simple lots for ownership options, similar to what I'm going to talk about with the Senate Bill 458, which gets a little confusing. I'll hope to explain the difference on those in a minute. Proposal number 8 allows for cottage clusters in certain areas. So we're still talking about those maintained streets outside the Z, and there are certain minimum site size requirements. So in the R2.5 and R5 zones, it's going to be 5,000 square feet. In the R7 and R10 zones, it starts at 7,000 square feet. The maximum site size is an acre, and that's a bit to limit how much of an impact that these cottage clusters can have. They tend to range in numbers of units somewhere between 3 units up to 16 units. So there's no real density number. Once you have a site that qualifies for a cottage cluster, if you can figure out how to fit 16 units on that site, that's the density you get, all the way up to an acre in size. The units themselves are intended to be small, so they have a 900 square foot footprint maximum. So when we're talking about building coverage, that's how much of the lot the actual building can be, the dwelling unit itself. It works a little bit differently than building coverage in the other development situations, but if you think about the dwelling units for cottage clusters, basically 30 by 30 footprint. They have a 2-story height limit, and on average, they should be no greater than 1,400 square feet. So what this is intended to accomplish is if you had a number of different units in the cottage cluster, you could have variety in the size and types of units, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, so 1,000 square foot unit and an 1,800 square foot unit, as long as they all average out to 1,400 square feet. They also have to be separated from each other. So part of the requirements of this House bill is that they be detached units that orient around a common courtyard. So one of the ways we ensure that they're detached is require at least 6 feet of separation. If they go broader than that, if they have more separation, than the common outdoor area requirements are slightly less. So the courtyards, 150 square feet required per unit. Like I mentioned, it's 200 square feet when the units are separated by less than 10 feet. So if you're giving up some of your side yard, you have to give that back to the common courtyard. 450 square foot minimum. So again, if you think about the 3 units required to make a cottage cluster, 3 units times 150 gets you 450 square feet for your minimum size. As you add cottages to that development, that size gets bigger. 15-foot minimum dimension in each direction. And at least half of the units have to orient towards the courtyard. Units that are located up closer to the street will need to be oriented towards the street to have that continue that sort of interaction, the street presence that other development along the street would be required to have. So this takes us to the Z overlay, which, you know, if we could do this a little backwards, we'd probably start with the Z overlay. But it just sort of flows in the proposal list. So the Z constrained sites overlay applies in areas with natural resources, natural hazards like landslide, floodplain, or wildfire. There's a couple sort of special exceptions for areas with future industrial comprehensive plan designations, but they're very small, located up in the Columbia corridor, as well as a couple spots around the airport noise, international airport, due to noise concerns. So this map is showing the areas that are where the Z already applies in the R25, R5, and R7 zones. So if you look at the map and you see all the yellow areas are the R25, R5, and R7 zones. The current Z, those pink areas, applies to about 9,000 of the 134,000 lots in those zones. The gray on the map, the lighter gray and the dark gray, are R10 and R20, which are not part of the current Z because they're not part of the initial middle housing proposal. So we're making a few changes as part of this project. The current Z overlay, like I said, applies to R25, R5, and R7 zones. It applies to areas with natural resources that have been inventoried. So that's low, medium, and high value areas of natural resources, the basis for how we make decisions about our environmental overlay zones, and landslide and floodplain areas. So what's changing with the new Z overlay is we're adding R10 and R20. We are switching from natural resource inventory to the MAP-D zones themselves, and that's due to language in the Oregon Administrative Rules, specifically to House Bill 2001, that we can't rely on just the inventory. We have to rely on areas that are regulated and protected. We're using the same landslide and floodplain data. We are adding wildfire because those areas, while they were present in R2.5, R5, and R7 zones, were not prevalent in those zones. There are areas, but they are not widespread. As we incorporate R10 and R20, that issue became much more top of mind. And then we're adding the industrial sanctuary and the airport noise overlays, like I mentioned. So what does that look like? Well, if you remember the last map with all the gray has now become green, the R10 and R20 zones. About 3/4 of the R10 and R20 zones are encumbered by the Z overlay because they have the presence of lots of natural resource and natural hazards. So if you look at this map, there are areas where the green sort of peeks through here and there, but by and large, those zones, those lower density zones, were zoned primarily because they have a number of different types of constraints and development constraints. So they're not exceptionally positioned for higher density middle housing. So in those areas, we would be looking at duplexes only, duplexes or house with an ADU. But in some spots, about, doing my math here, 3,500 lots, there would be some opportunity for those higher forms of middle housing. Finally, we get to the expedited middle housing land division. And this responds to Senate Bill 458 specifically. It allows duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters to be divided so that each unit is able to be on its own lot. It's important to note that this doesn't apply to some of the other housing types that we're proposing with RIP2, like the additional accessory dwelling units or the affordable sixplex. So it's specific to the middle housing types that are mentioned in House Bill 2001. There are some requirements that, well, we'll talk about these in a minute. But one thing to think about, so I mentioned the attached house example and how it's very similar to what you might see with the middle housing land division. So here's an image of a fourplex. If it went through a regular land division for attached houses, you would see the same sort of thing with property lines going through the building, separating each of these units onto its own lot. Senate Bill 458 allows that same arrangement to occur through an expedited process, meaning fewer approval criteria, faster timeline, but it also allows for some other types of flexibility. So the image on the left here, if you can follow this being the original property line, this dashed blue line, and this being the street out front. Here you have a fourplex that sort of runs front to back on the lot, and the middle housing land division allows the lot to be divided sort of horizontally like this. So there's only one lot has street frontage. The other lots don't have any street frontage. They're serviced through an access or utility easement, or possibly a separate tract for utilities and access. There are no minimum lot size requirements. So these lots could be any size as long as the original parent parcel met the requirements for siting a fourplex. The other way to do the similar type of development is like the previous image. So the fourplex is running sideways. You have separate lots running front to back. All these units have frontage on a street. All the lots have frontage on a street. But again, there would be no requirements for how wide these lots had to be or how much frontage was available, or the lot size themselves for the resulting lots. Again, the main thing being to contemplate how or whether the fourplex meets the development standards for the parent parcel as a whole. The building code is going to look at how each unit on each lot complies with the building code. So there's different building standards that apply because of those intervening property lines. There's a requirement for separate utilities to each of the dwelling units, so you don't have party line sewers and you're not sharing backups. That would not be a good thing. And only one dwelling unit per lot is allowed. So that's another condition of these land divisions. So that's it for the proposals. The state has given the cities a deadline of July 1st, 2022 to adopt the changes into our zoning codes. If we don't do that, we have to apply the state's model code, which would be messy and create a lot of confusion because they use similar construct as our zoning code, but not quite the same. So there's a lot of close but not quite matching terminology and development requirements with a lot of potential for a lot of confusion. So our timeline is we're at the PSC basically starting at the end of the month with hearings beginning in December. They'll have a recommendation by February. We'll be at City Council sometime in April, hopefully with their final decision by June to get us effective by July 1st. To learn more, you can go to our Residential Infill Project website. I'm going to try it again, www.portland.gov/BPS/RIP2. You can read the proposals there. You can sign up for future updates. You can ask staff questions, either call us or send us an email. And you can go to the map app to submit testimony. In terms of what's next in our timeline, we're briefing the Planning and Sustainability Commission November 30th at 5 p.m. So they'll see a similar presentation to this. It might go a little deeper into some other details and a little lighter on other details. Since they went through RIP1, they don't need to hear so much about that. The public hearing at the PSC will be December 14th at 5 o'clock. You can register to testify there or submit your testimony through the map app. Like I mentioned, PSC's recommendation will be late winter 2022 with City Council review in the spring. And to submit testimony, again, you can go to the map app, you can submit through regular US mail or attend the virtual hearing by registering in advance. This information is also on our website. It's inside the front covers of our staff report. And if you sign up for the updates, we'll be sure to remind you when we send out the next update. And that's all I've got. What do you got for questions?
We've got some questions, and
All right.
yeah, thanks Phil and Shannon for answering a bunch of the questions that are coming in. One question, of course, let's talk about the Z overlay a little bit more. Was the Z overlay part of the House bill, or is it determined locally?
Great. So the House bill, the administrative rules for the House bill talk about areas that the cities can, well, actually we have some obligations under statewide planning goals to protect and regulate areas of interest, things like Goal 5 natural resources and Goal 7 natural hazards. So the House bill and its administrative rules recognize that and give cities the ability to determine whether or not to allow higher forms of middle housing in those areas. So it's somewhat of a local decision in terms of which areas are selected to be included in a thing like the Z overlay. The Z overlay itself is an invention by the city of Portland. Other cities may approach that differently. We decided to use an overlay tool because it makes it clear to applicants where those restrictions would apply. Other cities might just apply it by looking up the data specifically for that parcel, going through background maps and making a determination of whether those protected areas exist on the lot or not. So this was a way of making it easier for people, a little more clear and objective for people to understand where those restrictions would be applicable.
Let's see, another Z overlay question. My vacant lots are now in the Z overlay, classified as wildfire danger. They're 95% clear of brush and trees. What's the criteria for determining wildfire hazard, and can I contest it?
Yeah,
That's
so
from
there's
Stephen.
there are the criteria, excuse me. Sorry, the criteria for the wildfire hazard mapping consists of the topography of the area, the presence of certain types of flammable vegetation, the density of that vegetation, and there's some climate aspect to that, the climate for this region. So those all contribute a different point score. Those scores were totaled, and if you got above a certain number, in this case the number was 5, that whatever that little pixel on the data mapping got flagged as wildfire hazard. So it wasn't a parcel by parcel determination. It was looking at an entire area using a resolution of a certain grid cell. So they divvied up the city in a bunch of grids, and within each grid they looked at the presence of the topography, the vegetation, and the vegetation density, and gave it a score. And so that created a blip, and when the lot fell inside that blip, it got flagged as being inside the wildfire hazard area. There is a process currently underway because the state passed an omnibus bill to look at wildfire mapping as a hazard across the state and come up with a more consistent methodology. Those discussions are ongoing now with new mapping coming in the next couple of years. So we anticipate that we'll have a new wildfire hazard map in the next couple of years that will require us to, well, will likely require us to reevaluate the location of that wildfire mapping.
One thing I don't think we mentioned tonight, which we had a question about last night, is that this Z overlay and these new allowances don't require any property owner to do anything. So if you own a home and you want to live in that home, you're not required to add accessory dwelling units, or you're not required by any means to demolish a house and rebuild to a duplex or anything else. It just provides allowances. So if you aren't planning on doing anything and you're getting the Z, then there's actually no difference, right?
Yeah, the other, I think that's a really good reminder, and just to put a finer point on it in terms of the new building size limits, because the question I heard previously was if my house is already above the maximum size, what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It means it's relevant if you are planning to do a major alteration that adds square footage, something above that 250 square foot bump, in fact. So if you're already above the maximum size and you're doing an addition more than 250 square feet, that FAR is relevant. But if you're below the maximum size, or you're going to do a small addition, then it doesn't have really any impact on you.
So the last Z overlay question from Ralph is, by declaring the lot now in the Z overlay, what's the impact on insurance cost?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question for your insurance company. But the thing to remember is the Z is not just a hazard overlay. It is the presence of natural resources and other things. So an insurance company that just sees the Z overlay being applied wouldn't be able to make a determination of whether that impacts that's resulting from a natural hazard or not. The data that we're relying on for the mapping, the wildfire map has been around since 1998, I think. The landslide hazard data is from the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DOGAMI, and that was released in 2014. So that's a state agency. The floodplain data is from FEMA, so that obviously has some link to your insurance, but that's a whole different program. So I'm not sure that the Z has any impact on your insurance rates, but I'm not your insurance company, so that might be something you want to check with them.
But we didn't create any new data sets with this project. We're relying on data sets that presumably insurance companies already have access to, and maps that were already created by these other agencies, correct?
That's right.
Right. Okay, thank you. Let me, a couple more Z overlays. One is from Noah. So in areas wildfire constrained, what if the trees are removed? Could that change the constraint and thus lift the Z overlay?
Theoretically, if enough trees were being removed, that might change it. If we did another evaluation of the area. And so I think one of the issues that is prompting this discussion around updating the wildfire mapping is a lot has changed in the last 2 decades. The climate has changed, development conditions have changed, vegetation has changed. So the need to kind of take another fresh look at that wildfire condition is there, but we had to rely on the data that was available. We didn't have the time to, we have a deadline of 2022 to get this project adopted, and the state's conversation around wildfire is going to take longer than that. So in the interim, we're using the data that we have available.
So the city of Portland doesn't maintain our own wildfire hazard map. It's the state of Oregon that meant that.
No.
No.
For now, we've got a wildfire map that the city adopted.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And for the county has a separate wildfire map that they adopted. But ultimately, the state will have a more centralized, kind of the way they're doing landslide mapping or floodplain mapping, and will be managed by the state.
A couple questions from John. Does the Z overlay designation have an impact on application of the tree code?
No. So whatever requirements apply for the tree code in a development situation in terms of preservation standards and tree planting. If your lot has areas that are environmentally zoned as well, so you could have a Z and a C. So you've got conservation overlay. Anything that happens within that environmental overlay may have different regulations for trees.
And similar question, if a non-Z lot abuts a Z common area tract, would lot line adjustment between them change the Z status?
Yeah, we've been talking about that one. That's an interesting interesting issue, and I think we can address it. I don't want to make promises because we're still discussing the procedures exactly, but I think we can address it through a map error correction process. So that's our current thinking. We will know more by the time we get to the Planning Commission.
And Marita is asking, is the landslide risk being applied to the Z overlay shown as the geologic hazard map or the regulatory landslide hazard area?
Oh, yeah. Wow. That's some good
Eagle
deep
eyes.
Yeah, some good deep knowledge. It is not the regulatory landslide hazard map that the Title 33 uses for land divisions. It is more precise, the Dogami maps, which show deep landslide, high level of susceptible landslide areas, potentially rapidly moving landslide, and scarps and deposits. So there's three data layers directly from Dogami's mapping that are different than what we have in the Title 33 landslide map.
We have appreciation from someone saying great work.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Give
Can
me
you
my top drop.
yeah, can you explain what financial incentives are proposed to motivate people to build more units, presumably to redevelop?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that one. Would love to hear ideas. So in terms of the underlying dials that we have for incenting the market to produce more units versus a large house, we tailored the FAR requirement to only allow for a certain size house, a larger size duplex, a larger size triplex or fourplex. With the cottage clusters, you're getting a lot more potential units on a lot than you would otherwise get. So if you're thinking about the market trying to provide a product that more people can access, they can afford, that's more smaller units that individually are going to cost less, but the overall product is going to get more value. So 2 duplexes, I'm going to throw some random numbers out here that are not based in any kind of reality. 2 duplexes at $600,000 a piece versus 1 house at $900,000. So each of those units more affordable, 600,000, more affordable than 900,000. But the overall product that the developer is selling is 1.2 million versus 900,000. So that's a little bit of the financial incentive there, but it's not city money coming to the table. It's just relying on the private market for that.
There was definitely a lot of conversation about that during Residential Infill Project Part 1. Several of the planning commissioners were really concerned about who would be able to afford to redevelop their property. Even an accessory dwelling unit detached costs, I don't know,
200,000
or 200,000. That was when we started the project, with the cost and the supply chain issues now and the lack of workers. It's probably even higher. So definitely a concern.
Yeah, I think the just on that point, the provisions for accessory dwelling units were really kind of intended to create the ability for people to incrementally add units without disrupting their living condition. So rather than redeveloping, which that's a big undertaking, requires a lot of capital investment and commitment, the ADUs provide the ability to invest a little bit here, wait a number of years till the equity is gained in the ownership there, and then potentially add a second one. And then, you know, at some point you might just start converting that into cottage clusters and keep going.
Speaking of cottage clusters, We have a question about that. When working with cottage clusters, is it possible to share utilities like sewer that would help with affordability? Can you talk more to how this would work?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit, but really it's the Bureau of Environmental Services is our sewer folks, and they get really nervous when I try to talk about their requirements. But there is potential for doing shared sewers for the development that go out to the street. So a combined system for the development that can reduce those costs. It'd be private plumbing on site versus the public system, which is a little less expensive. With the caveat, so I mentioned SB 458 and dividing middle housing. In that case, the utilities are required to be separate for each dwelling unit. So if you're just building a cottage cluster and they're all going to share one site, and you're going to go through potentially a condominium type platting process, that might be an option for you. If you're looking at going through SB 458 and dividing it and creating fee simple lots, those utilities would have to be separated. So that's a little bit of the plus and minus, the weighing of options that would be required.
The previous person who was asking about financial incentives wrote back and says, that's why I'm asking about financial incentives. We added an ADU in 2017. It cost $200,000. The financial incentive was decreased permitting costs, which is probably the decrease of the waiving of the systems development charges, which goes to pay for city infrastructure projects. So I'm wondering, back to that was my little editorial in the middle. So I'm wondering if you're expecting real estate development companies to develop the 3-4 duplexes and cottage clusters.
Yeah, I think it's a more smaller scale builders that are currently in the home building market that can build a product that's still using residential building code. So largely that's going to be side-by-side units built to a townhouse code. That seems to be in the wheelhouse of smaller home builders. These tend to be projects that are too small for major investment companies to be interested in. They're looking at larger developments, larger apartment type buildings. So it's a kind of your local home builder looking for ways to leverage more value out of a lot.
And Jennifer has another question about the Z overlay. So in the Z overlay, duplexes will be permitted. Will increased ADUs or less constraints on ADUs also happen? Are the ADU regulations going to change for properties in the Z overlay? I think maybe is another way of asking it.
Yeah, so no, you can do a house with an ADU or a duplex. So it's essentially thinking about it's 1 or 2 dwelling units, whether it's going to be a larger house and a smaller ADU or 2 medium-sized duplex units or whatever. We would start to run into trouble if we said we would allow for a house and 2 ADUs, but we wouldn't allow for a triplex, because then it begs the question, what's the difference? And if it's a size limitation, then we'd say, oh, well, triplexes with 800 square foot units are allowed, but 801 square feet is not allowed. So it creates a sort of cascading effect of questions. So in order to maintain sort of regulatory simplicity, we drew the line at 2 units inside the Z, 3 or more units outside.
And maybe it's worth mentioning the basement ADU change for all ADUs.
Oh, yeah. So another change that happened with residential infill part 1, we'd heard a lot of concern about folks that had attempted to convert basements into accessory dwelling units, and their basements were 850 square feet. And the maximum size for an ADU is 800 square feet. Or the house was going to be half the size or the full size of the ADU down below, and it's supposed to be a 75% size relationship. Anyways, for a basement conversion, we eliminated that size relationship. So if you're converting a basement in an existing house, as long as the entire ADU is contained in the basement, it doesn't go elsewhere in the house, that size limit no longer applies. So that starts to etch away at what's the distinction between a house with an internal ADU versus a duplex, because now there's no real size and limitation between those 2 units. But we felt that was an appropriate amount of flexibility to give houses a little little more incentive for continuing them allowing them to continue to be retained.
And is that provision already on the books for R10 and R20, or is that being proposed with this project?
Oh, I'm going to wait for Shannon to chime in here, but my impression is that that already applies citywide if you're
I
doing
think so.
duplex
That's what-
or you're
that's
doing
what I
a
think.
ADU in the basement.
It does.
All right, excellent. I
Thanks,
got it right.
Shannon. Shannon's our code editor, so she keeps it and she has it all in her head. Another question. I've read this RIP1 and RIP2 are not being done in any other city in the USA. So it feels like an experiment. I'm trained in science, so please excuse me. What kind of follow-up does the city of Portland plan to do to find out if this project actually creates more affordable housing?
Awesome question. It is a little experimental. We are not the only ones in the country anymore. So places like Austin have tried it. They're not quite there yet. Tacoma is right on the verge. Minneapolis passed some policies and they're working on their codes now.
Their
Seattle.
codes went into effect already. I just talked to them.
Oh, there you go.
Yes.
Seattle's done some similar work. But in terms of answering the question, we also
And Oregon, of course, now.
yeah,
Sorry.
state of Oregon, yeah.
Now the whole state of Oregon too.
Oh, and California.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're talking to Washington this week.
Yeah. So first-ish, but soon not to be so long. But as part of the passage of House Bill 2001, there was a requirement added to cities reporting on their housing needs analysis, which is I think it's a 5-year or 7-year period of reporting on the production of housing, including certain types of housing. And the things that they added specifically to that bill were middle housing units, so duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, cottage clusters, and attached houses, and then affordable, regulated affordable units. I think what we will not see a whole lot of is the production of affordable units until our nonprofit partners start to acquire more sites and can start building them. But I think initially the market rate builders are going to have to sort of pioneer and figure out the codes and figure out the model that works, and then the affordable housing providers sort of follow in their footsteps once they do that.
I also think this was part of the discussion for residential infill part 1, is if it was the objective to try to create more affordable housing units, and the answer was no. The objective was to allow people in Portland to be able to access and live in a greater variety of neighborhoods. You saw the maps that Morgan shared, and all the yellow areas are basically, it's a lot of area for fewer people compared to the multi-dwelling and the downtown development. So I'm not sure if you meant affordable, like regulated affordable, which we would consider with a capital A affordable, or less expensive. And we use that terminology a lot with this project, is the new units should be less expensive just by virtue of the land being divided into 2, 3, or 4 units. And just increasing they said I meant less expensive. Yep, that's it.
Okay.
So we're on the same page there then. And obviously the city is doing whatever we can to increase the supply of housing, because as the supply of housing increases, we still have quite a bit of in-migration. Even during the pandemic, we've seen in-migration during this time.
Yeah, and so that on the less affordable, or I'm sorry, less expensive, aka lowercase affordable, there isn't that similar requirement from the state, and it's a little harder to track because it requires a little more in-depth study. But we intend on monitoring the development, at least for a period of time, to figure out what is happening out there, what's being produced, and at what price point, just so we have a better understanding. But if you want to start a thesis.
So another question about land divisions. If you do want to use, and I think we answered this question, but at the very end, there's a twist to it. So if you do want to use Senate Bill 458 for fee simple lot housing with cottage clusters, are there any opportunities to share utilities like sewer? Condos are more expensive to set up, and there are contractor issues building them, insurance-related contractor issues. Who would we need to reach out to if there is still an opening to discuss before the rules are finalized?
Oh, on the shared utility aspect of that?
Yes.
Yeah, that conversation is closed. It's a requirement in the Senate bill itself, this requirement for separated utilities. So the bill is, if you want to change it, you have to go back to the legislature and have them adopt different legislation to change that. Wasn't something we did, in other words.
I'm just going to look at that question again. Did I ask it the right way? I don't know how to look at it anymore. Oh, I know. That's what it's like. Oh, shared utilities. Okay. So the Senate Bill 458 says that the utilities need to be separated.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, we are exploring ways to try to be as flexible as we can in terms of what that looks like, but there are certain limits to how flexible we can be within the language of that bill. So.
Okay. Another question, just curious, are other municipalities in the Portland metro area, Gresham, Beaverton, Tiger, Tualatin, doing similar things because of the state mandate?
Yeah, I've been meeting on a monthly basis with the planners of what I call our neighbors. So Gresham and Lake Oswego, Milwaukee, and Beaverton in Washington County. Just to kind of get a sense of how they're approaching these rules, and we all have a different take on it, a little bit of a different approach, but yeah, everyone's moving along. I think Milwaukee actually, they may have adopted rules already, at least. They might have gotten through planning commission. I might have that a little bit wrong, but yeah, all the cities in Metro are working on it.
All the cities in the metro area are treated in one way, right? Because didn't the state have different rules for bigger cities versus smaller cities?
Yeah, I forget what the cutoff for smaller cities was. Below 25,000 down to a certain size, and I don't know what that lower limit was. If you're a small city, you're just looking at duplexes wherever a house is allowed, and that's it. You can do these other things, but you're not required to. If you're a large city over 25,000, then it's the other forms of middle housing that are required. And within the metro area, it's any city regardless of size, looking at the full suite of middle housing.
Could you share your screen again and show us a map of the Z overlay? Because you showed it to the pink and yellow map. You showed before and then you showed the after. Let's go back to that map. William is asking in the last slide on the constrained Z overlay. So this is the before, this is current Z overlay.
Yeah.
So go to the proposed Z overlay. I think this is the one William means. Can you distinguish again between the yellow and the pink areas?
Well, the pink is the Z overlay, and that's going to apply, think of it, so it's an overlay. It's applying on top of the yellow and the green. So it actually is covering, in some areas, it's covering yellow, what would be yellow underneath that. And in other areas, it's covering over on top of the green. But underneath that, you can see these areas of green are the R10, R20, and all of this yellow are the R25, R5, and R7 that are outside of that Z overlay. Does that help?
I think so. That's probably what, and so stay on there a little bit. Jennifer asked, in the Z is proposed, how much could it vary when it's finalized?
That depends on the conversation that happens at the Planning Sustainability Commission and the City Council. We have observed from our conversation from last night's session that there were some lots that seem to have been mismapped. So we're looking at another run of quality control, checking on the data and making sure it matches up to the lots the right way. So there is some degree of change that we'll be introducing to the Planning and Sustainability Commission to clean that up. But in terms of sort of the bigger swings, the changes to either add another type of constraint or remove a constraint from consideration, that's not going to be a staff proposal. That would have to be direction from one of those recommending or decision-making bodies.
Okay, can you flip forward to those two diagrams for Senate Bill 458 land divisions? That one, yeah. So Douglas is asking regarding Senate Bill 458, I can easily imagine separated utilities as a poison pill as regards the 3, 4, and 6-plex townhouse scenarios on mid-block lots. Are BES and water showing any flexibility on the spacing of the lines?
Yeah, so we're having conversations about that. One opportunity that we're talking about is a shared main, like be it a private main or I don't think we're going to do a public main, but a shared main with separate laterals that run to each dwelling unit. So that's different than separate laterals that are coming off of each unit out to the street, because that, you know, for spacing, you're never going to meet it. Even with that, there's still some concern about whether we can get the spacing requirements to be met. And it's not just BES and water, it's a state DEQ and Oregon Health Authority question. So there's some concerns going back up to the state level saying, hey, you asked us to separate these utilities, but your standards don't let that happen very easily. So we're still talking about it.
Okay, on this same slide, Tim is asking, in the Build Small Coalition meeting earlier today, a concern was raised that the RIP2 proposed draft would not allow or would hinder a lot being divided and then townhouses, townhouses, which in Portland we call those attached houses, created on the resulting lots. To put our minds to rest, could you walk through how a lot under our proposed draft could be divided per Senate Bill 458 into X number of lots, where X is the number of dwelling units that would be allowed on the lot, and then this many adjoining townhouses created?
I'm not sure I totally get that, and I don't think I have the right diagrams to help that conversation. But in terms of numbers of units, again, think about SB 458 is dividing duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage clusters. If you had if you can get a fourplex on the lot, SB 458 allows you to divide those 4 units into 4 lots, plus any addition.
The idea is that you're building and then dividing, or doing it simultaneously.
Essentially, yeah, yeah. You could have a situation where you've got a very large lot. So say it's double this size, double the size of this, and you like, well, I could get 2 fourplexes there. You have a couple options. You could go through a regular land division and create 2 lots, each one with a fourplex, and then SB 458 land divide those fourplexes separately. Or you could do it all under one process through an attached house land division. So you just set it up and divide the lot into attached house lots.
Which you had a previous slide of that, didn't you? Isn't that proposal number 6 before the cottage cluster? The number 7.
Yeah, yeah. So you could imagine two sets of attached houses with new property lines running through all of those, all under one application, under one regular land division. Or you could take that large site and split it in half and put 2 fourplexes and then divide those fourplexes through SB 458. So a couple different ways to get there. Regular land division probably in that case be a little bit faster and a little more straightforward.
And part of the confusion is that the House bill was saying we need to allow for attached houses. The Senate bill was being drafted at the same time, saying you need to allow for land divisions for the middle housing types. So then you get up to things that look similar but have different sets of rules, correct?
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, this would be a set of attached houses, or you could think of this as a fourplex that's been divided through SB 458. And
Mhm.
unless you're looking at the plat, you're probably not going to know the difference.
Mhm. And Tim's also following up on something which I think Douglas had a similar, not a question, but a supposition that I think we should clarify. Does the proposed draft support a lot being divided into 6 lots under the affordable sixplex provision that is already allowed through RIP1?
No. And in fact, the SB 458, pretty narrow. We got a very limited set of criteria, a very narrow set of appeal standards. One of those appeal standards is that your development doesn't qualify as a middle housing type under HB 2001. So if you in some way are not a middle housing type, i.e. a sixplex, then you can't qualify for an SB 458 land division. You might still be able to do a cottage cluster, so split them up, or you might be able to have enough width to do a series of attached houses.
We have one question left, and it's Douglas McLeod's, and it's, you know, he was asking a question earlier about the water and sewer lines. If Water Bureau and BES were going to require less separation, and he has a question that says shared main private. That's it.
Probably. I don't know. I don't know that answer yet.
Yeah, and the bureaus don't know the answer yet, right? Because you all are working with the bureaus to try to figure out how this is all going to play out.
Yeah, what we're really trying to flag at this stage is, are there code obstacles? Do the bureaus have code requirements that are in direct conflict with SB 458? Because those we'll have to remove. On the backside of that, we're also trying to figure out what are some of the potential ways that this could work on a site. So we're going to run through some scenarios and test their standards to see what happens, see how feasible this actually is, and then
Good.
yeah, look at ways
Sounds good.
to make it better. So.
You're not going to believe this, Morgan, but it's already 8:30. We've been at this since, yeah, it's 8:30.
We must have been having fun.
I know we are having a really good time. So it's 8:30. So I want to be mindful of people's time. We have 16 people who have stuck in here with us. So I'm going to call it a night because we're at our time. I should let my staff get to their dinners if they need to. Some appreciations are coming in through. We were caught up on all of our questions.
Well, you know what? We'll make the plug. Send our residential.infill@portlandoregon.gov email.
Tim, I'm going to ask you to send that question into that email address, and then we can answer it directly, since we're losing people as we speak here, and we can close out the meeting and the recording in a more graceful way. So thank you all for joining us tonight. This was the Residential Infill Project Part 2, and please call or email us if you have questions, and we will get back to you before the hearing at Planning Commission on December 14th.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Morgan.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.